over the last 20 years, national inequalities mostly increased. It does not mean that it increased everywhere, in every country. And of course, there are exceptions. I will be happy to talk about that, particular exceptions in Latin America, like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, very important countries with very high levels of inequality, but where inequality went down. But by and large, everywhere else, it went up. And this is also something which I think is obvious. It went up in the United States, as we know quite well. So we have this upward going shape, meaning that the gains were greater the higher are you in the distribution. So obviously, the people at the very top gained the most. And this is not an unusual shape. As I'll show you like several countries. I'm not going to go through each of them, but I showed like Philippines and Bangladesh, Mexico and Colombia. You see this upward shape everywhere. Rural and urban China, which is quite interesting. Not only is it upward, but the red line is urban China. So at every point of the distribution, people in the urban distribution gain more than people in rural distribution, which means that, of course, urban-rural gap increased. So this shape is really, we find it in many countries. And what explains then the kind of peculiar S shape in the global level? Now, what explains that is that, of course, the countries grow at uneven rates of growth. And you have, of course, the bulk of the large countries, like obviously India, China, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and others, relatively poor. And if they grow at relatively high growth rates, and even with the increase in income inequality within themselves, you still end up with this large gain for the median person in the world, which explains that, as I said, that unusual shape and that particular hump at the very top.
These measures do appear to be associated with economic instability, but perhaps not in the most direct way. I'm not going to make the claim that a prior increase of inequality caused the financial crisis. I'm going to make the claim that the rise of inequality and the onset of the financial crisis were two aspects of the same thing, that they were, in fact, two ways of measuring the same process. And the analogy that I would offer to you, which unfortunately isn't in the book, it's like that remark that you think of making, you should have made just as you're leaving the party when you could have made it, is that these measures are really very like blood pressure. They're very like blood pressure. That is to say, there's a range that is considered healthy. And when you're within that range, lower is better on the whole. It is possible for the range to be too low, right? Zero inequality is something like zero blood pressure that you're basically going to encounter in the morgue, right? But the thing you should worry about is when that number starts to rise. And when it rises above the range, it may be asymptomatic. It may be something that you don't actually notice. It may be part of a process that you actually enjoy. Right? But it is a sign that you're heading for a crisis. And the crisis, when it happens, is a very serious matter, which can have the effect of impairing your capacity to function, the possibility of economic progress, of basic justice and fairness, of meeting human needs in a serious way for a long time to come. And I think that is fundamentally what did happen. We allowed inequality to get out of hand. We were relying on credit mechanisms to generate growth at the price of enriching very small numbers of people in increasingly corrupt ways. And we experienced a collapse of the institutions that have supported that process, from which we have not recovered and which we really haven't faced so far.
If you look at the people who are at the top, that top 1%, which top 1/10 of 1% that has gotten so much of the wealth, a lot of it has to do with what economists call rank seeking. You look at the list of people, a lot of people who are monopolists and gotten large amounts of monopoly ranks among the top 2 or 3 of the people in the world in terms of wealth are among those people who've extracted monopoly ranks. A lot of CEOs who take advantage of deficiencies in corporate governance have been able to get for themselves a disproportionate share of the revenues of the corporation for themselves. The question is, how do we distinguish between these two different hypotheses, that is, marginal productivity or rank seeking? Let me say one more word about rank seeking. One of the, we talk about ranks, we're used to thinking of the Middle East, oil countries, as associated with ranks. And these are rank-seeking economies, and these are economies with high levels of inequality. We're not used to thinking of the United States as a rank-seeking economy or the UK as a rank-seeking economy. But when you start looking at detail, you look at the financial sector, you look at the role of monopolies, it becomes very clear that rank-seeking is very important. An interesting statistical study, a way of trying to discriminate among these alternative hypotheses, is to ask the question, what happens when you raise the tax on the top 1%? And some Emmanuel Saiz at Berkeley and two of his co-authors have actually asked that question and looked at what the consequences are. If the major explanation of what was going on was marginal productivity theory, you would have thought raising the taxes would discourage work and you would see lower economic growth. Would contribute less. On the other hand, if it is rank-seeking which is going on, if you tax rank-seeking, people will put less effort at rank-seeking and you will succeed in getting less inequality and won't have an adverse effect on economic growth. Well, the fact that I'm mentioning it, you know what the result was. That higher taxes at the top did not lead to slower economic growth. Now, that's an idea, of course, that one of the two parties simply rejects. But that party often rejects any fact-based analysis.
There is a difference between inequalities of the scale that we have in a world in which there are absolute deprivations of the kind that we have, and inequalities of the same relative scale in a world without such absolute deprivations. To use an example I've used in the classroom, the same inequalities between millionaires and billionaires of the same relative proportions might not perturb us too much if all that they meant were that some people had faster robots and larger yachts. But in our world, the inequalities that we have are associated with absolute deprivations, which has a very different moral valence and significance. Mark Zuckerberg is a billionaire because he is gaining rents from having a particular place in a global network, which is hard now to displace. He enjoys the benefits of what my friend, the law professor David Graywall, calls network power. And a number of non-financial enterprises of that kind also have gigantic rents which come from network power. On the other hand, and that you might think would exist even in the society of millionaires and billionaires if it was organized in a certain way. On the other hand, there are absolute deprivations caused by the production of this smartphone. I finally succumbed and moved over to the brave new world, as we all know, because some of the components of the smartphone come from places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where civil wars are in part being fueled by the need to command shrinking resources for the global production chain, which are available in finite quantities. And in our world, with absolute deprivations, that is something of great concern. Thank you.